The room was dim, lit only by the trembling flame of a single candle perched precariously on a wooden desk scarred with age and wear. Shadows flickered against the walls, stretching and recoiling like restless spirits. At the center of the desk lay the diary, its leather cover cracked and brittle, the scent of old paper mingling with a faint metallic tang that made the air almost taste like iron. It was the kind of object that seemed to breathe with a life of its own, one that demanded attention and yet invited fear. The first time its owner had discovered the unusual marks, they had dismissed them as smudges, perhaps a trick of the light or a careless spill. But the more they observed, the more unsettling the reality became. There was no explanation for the way fresh, crimson ink had appeared across the pages overnight, forming words that were both intimate and ominous. The handwriting, though neat and deliberate, bore a strange familiarity, as if it knew the thoughts and fears the owner had kept buried even from themselves. The owner, a young woman of quiet demeanor and studious habits, initially approached the diary with curiosity, a tentative fascination that slowly curdled into dread. She ran her fingers over the sticky, dried lines, tracing the letters as if touching them could reveal their source. Each word seemed laden with intent, a deliberate communication from an unknown hand. Some phrases addressed events that had occurred earlier that day, personal incidents that no one else could have known. The room felt heavier with each page turned, the shadows seeming to press inward, the flickering candlelight casting shapes that danced like specters across the walls. There was an unsettling intimacy in the messages, a sense that the diary was not just a book, but a mirror reflecting the deepest recesses of her mind. Even as disbelief battled terror, the owner could not ignore the physical evidence. Each morning, the diary seemed to have written something new, the red ink bright and glistening as though still wet, though no one had touched it. There were nights spent staring into the dark, watching for movement, listening for sounds that never came, yet always feeling a presence hovering just beyond perception. Friends and family, when told, initially laughed or dismissed the claims, attributing them to stress, imagination, or youthful eccentricity. Yet their skepticism did little to quell the gnawing sense of unease that gripped the household. The diary was no ordinary book, and its mysterious messages were no harmless trick. There was a malevolent precision to its communication, a slow-burning cruelty that both fascinated and terrified. As the days passed, the diary seemed to insist upon a rhythm, an almost ritualistic schedule in which it would inscribe its crimson lines. The owner began to dread the nights, anticipating the moment when she would find herself face to face with its latest revelation. There was an eerie stillness in the house during these moments, the kind of silence that makes ordinary sounds echo in unnatural ways. Even the faintest creak of the floorboards or the softest sigh of wind through the cracks of the window felt amplified, a soundtrack to the invisible dialogue unfolding within the pages of the diary. It was as though the room itself had become an accomplice, conspiring with the book to heighten the sense of fear and helplessness. The diary's messages were not just words, they carried a weight, a moral and emotional gravity that pressed upon the owner's mind. Each letter seemed to be chosen to provoke reflection, doubt, and anxiety, touching on personal secrets that had never been confessed, never been spoken aloud. The owner found herself awake long after the candle had burned down, staring at the ceiling, recalling phrases that made her skin crawl, questioning whether reality itself had shifted into a darker dimension. There were moments when the hand that had once scribbled normal, mundane journal entries felt absent, replaced by an intelligence both intimate and alien. The diary was alive, in a sense that defied reason, and its presence cast a shadow over the owner's every thought and action. Sleep became elusive, and ordinary daily routines took on a surreal quality. Walking through familiar corridors felt like traversing a labyrinth of fear, each step echoing with the unspoken threat of discovery. Even mundane objects seemed imbued with potential menace, the flicker of a curtain, the creak of a door hinge, the way the candlelight danced on the uneven plaster walls. The diary had become the epicenter of this strange gravity, pulling every attention, every thought, every quiet moment into its orbit. Friends who visited noted the haunted look in her eyes, the tension in her posture, and yet, when asked, she could barely articulate the depth of her dread. It was a private horror, one that belonged solely to her and the mysterious book. By the end of the first week, the realization had taken root that the diary was communicating in ways that could not be explained away by coincidence or chance. The messages were too specific, too timely, too intimately connected to her private life. It was no longer merely unsettling, it was profoundly terrifying. The room, once a place of solitude and reflection, had transformed into a chamber of apprehension, where every shadow, every flicker of light, seemed to hold meaning. The diary demanded attention, demanded response, demanded recognition of its presence in a world that otherwise functioned by rational rules. The young woman could sense the eyes of the unseen, a consciousness behind the crimson letters that knew her, studied her, anticipated her thoughts. In the dim glow of the candle, she would sometimes hear whispers in the periphery of hearing, voices that seemed to echo the diary's messages in cadence and tone. Each time she looked away from the pages, she felt a subtle compulsion to return, a magnetism that tethered her to the book and its incomprehensible communication. Sleep, conversation, and even meals became secondary to the engagement with the diary, as though her existence was now bound to the strange cycle of its writing. By the end of the first month, the diary had become a fixture of dread and fascination, a living testament to forces beyond comprehension. There was a palpable tension in the room whenever she approached it, a charged atmosphere that made the ordinary feel extraordinary and the familiar feel threatening. Every word in crimson ink carried layers of meaning, and the young woman was trapped in a slow spiral of curiosity, fear, and obsession. The diary had taken control not by force, but by a quiet, relentless insistence, embedding itself into the rhythm of her life. It was a presence that could not be ignored, a puzzle that demanded solving, a terror that demanded acknowledgement. The town lay shrouded in the muted haze of early morning, its streets narrow and cobblestoned, winding like veins through clusters of tightly packed homes. Fog rolled in from the surrounding pine forests, curling around the wooden shutters and church steeples, giving the small Georgian settlement an air of secrecy and unease. It was a place where everyone knew one another, where families carried histories intertwined with every brick, fence, and well. The townspeople lived simple lives, yet beneath the surface, old grudges, whispered scandals, and hidden ambitions simmered quietly. Even the most ordinary houses seemed to hold stories behind closed doors, and the town itself felt like a stage upon which centuries of superstition and inherited fears played out with meticulous care. The family that owned the blood-stained diary had long been a fixture in the community, respected for their lineage and social standing yet known for their private ways. The patriarch, a man of stern demeanor and unwavering routine, managed the family's affairs with precision, while his wife maintained the household with a quiet, almost imperceptible authority. Their children were raised with strict discipline, schooled in the doctrines of both religion and societal propriety, their behavior closely observed by neighbors who measured every act for conformity. Despite their outwardly serene appearance, the family had known tragedy, illnesses, and unexplained events that fueled whispers among townsfolk. Some said that the house itself carried a weight of history, that the walls absorbed sorrow and secret deeds over generations. Life in the town followed the rhythm of the seasons, church bells marking time, markets bustling on certain days, and rituals both religious and domestic anchoring daily existence. Yet beneath this predictable surface lay a complex tapestry of superstition, gossip, and fear. It was the kind of environment where unusual occurrences were quickly noticed, where deviations from custom invited scrutiny, and where the past was never truly past but instead lingered, shaping present events. Every street corner and alley had a story, and the family's home, situated near the edge of town, held its own collection of quiet, often unspoken narratives. The townspeople, though outwardly polite and neighborly, carried a subtle vigilance, a sense that unseen forces might be at work in places that seemed ordinary. The architecture reflected the town's long history. Weathered brick and timber-framed houses leaned slightly from age, their paint faded, roofs sagging under decades of neglect. The church, a tall, somber structure of stone and stained glass, towered over the town square, its shadow casting a permanent gloom in the mornings. Bells tolled solemnly, calling the faithful to prayer, while local children played in the narrow lanes, their laughter echoing with a strange incongruity against the ever-present sense of watchfulness. Even in moments of mundane life, there was an awareness of heritage, of tradition, and of the invisible threads connecting generations, shaping expectations and social behavior. Inside the family home, the contrast between public perception and private reality was striking. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with volumes on history, religion, and philosophy, yet corners of the house held faded portraits and objects that hinted at grief and secrets long buried. Candles burned late into the night, casting flickering light over well-worn furniture and tables etched with the marks of decades. It was in such a space that the diary would find its place, a seemingly ordinary object in a home that itself was anything but ordinary. The domestic routines, the preparation of meals, the meticulous cleaning, the quiet evenings by the hearth, masked undercurrents of tension, anxieties that had accumulated over generations. The household felt alive in subtle ways, with the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind through cracks, and the occasional unexplained chill hinting at a presence that defied explanation. The family's position in the town lent them influence, yet it also imposed scrutiny. Neighbors often observed their comings and goings with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. Social gatherings at the local church or in the market square highlighted the careful balance the family maintained between public respectability and private seclusion. Conversations were measured, appearances were curated, and every action had implications that could ripple through the small, tight-knit community. The diary's emergence into this context, therefore, carried not just personal significance but the weight of communal expectation, superstition, and inherited vigilance. Historical tensions between faith and emerging rational thought were also palpable in the town. Ministers preached from the pulpit about sin and divine judgment, while local scholars and physicians attempted to reconcile observed phenomena with reason and logic. Within the family home, this interplay manifested in daily life as strict adherence to religious practices alongside a fascination with scientific or philosophical inquiry. The contrast created a fertile ground for interpreting unusual events, where every shadow could be seen as an omen, and every unexplained occurrence could be filtered through layers of belief and skepticism. The townspeople were neither wholly credulous nor entirely rational. Instead, they existed in a delicate balance that allowed mysteries to take root and linger. As the diary made its quiet, insidious entrance into the household, the town itself became an unspoken character in the unfolding drama. Its streets, traditions, and histories shaped how events were perceived, giving context to fear and amplifying intrigue. The family's experiences could not be isolated from their surroundings. Whispers in the market, glances during church services, and subtle gestures of suspicion all created an atmosphere charged with anticipation. Even the natural landscape, the dense forests, rolling hills, and fog-laden riverbanks, seemed to conspire with the town's sense of secrecy, wrapping the community in a cocoon of uncertainty where the extraordinary could quietly assert itself without immediate detection. Within this setting, the diary's influence began subtly, interacting with the rhythms of the family's life and the town's collective consciousness. It was a world steeped in history, memory, and inherited fears, where appearances masked deeper currents of anxiety and unspoken knowledge. Each day brought ordinary routines, but in the undercurrents flowed the potential for the uncanny, for secrets to emerge and take form. The town, with all its charm and quaintness, was as much a stage for the unfolding mystery as the diary or its owner, providing context, contrast, and a sense of foreboding that would shape every encounter and observation. By immersing viewers in this meticulously detailed environment, the narrative highlights the tension between apparent normalcy and the hidden currents of dread that define the story. The stage is set, a town alive with history, a family conscious of its legacy, and a diary poised to disrupt both, introducing a sense of inevitability and suspense that will unfold in the days and weeks to come. The interplay between the town's outward serenity and the growing internal unrest establishes a foundational layer of atmosphere, priming the audience for the chilling events that will escalate from this seemingly ordinary setting. The first signs that the diary was far from ordinary emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly, yet with a weight that could not be ignored. The young woman initially noticed faint smudges on the pages that seemed to shift overnight, as though the words themselves had moved while she slept. At first, she convinced herself it was a trick of light or a result of her own carelessness, but the persistence of these marks soon undermined any rational explanation. One morning, she discovered letters formed in bright crimson ink, stark against the yellowed pages, spelling out phrases she had only whispered silently in the privacy of her room. The words were personal, almost intimate, addressing events and thoughts that had never been shared with another living soul. The immediate fear that gripped her was unlike anything she had experienced, a visceral chill that seemed to seep into her bones and linger there. As days passed, the diary's messages became increasingly precise, timing their appearances with moments of emotional intensity. The young woman would often find new passages after arguments with her family, during moments of private sorrow, or following fleeting thoughts of fear or doubt. Each message was carefully worded, carrying a tone that was simultaneously accusatory, empathetic, and disconcertingly informed. She began to note the patterns, trying to anticipate when the diary might write next, but the irregularity of the occurrences only heightened her anxiety. The simple act of turning the pages became a ritual fraught with anticipation, a dangerous engagement with a force that seemed to know her better than she knew herself. Family members began to notice subtle changes in her demeanor. She became withdrawn, avoiding casual conversation and spending long hours in her room, fingers brushing nervously over the diary's cover. Friends, when they visited, remarked on her distracted gaze and restless energy, though they could not comprehend the full extent of the strange phenomena. Attempts to read the diary aloud or involve others in deciphering its messages often failed, the words seemed to lose their immediacy, as if the diary responded only to her presence, only to her consciousness. This growing exclusivity of communication added layers of isolation, reinforcing the sense that the diary's power was both personal and inescapable. The young woman experimented with measures to uncover the source of the mysterious writing. She placed the diary under different lights, in sunlight, by the fireplace, and even near open windows, hoping environmental factors might explain the ink's sudden appearance. None of these tests produced rational results. She consulted simple remedies, thinking perhaps insects, condensation, or chemical reactions were at play, but each explanation proved insufficient. The diary remained resistant to investigation, producing new messages that defied logic and prediction. The contrast between her desire for understanding and the diary's impenetrable nature created a slow, creeping dread, a sense that the ordinary rules governing objects and words no longer applied. The early messages themselves carried an eerie tone. They were not random or nonsensical scribbles but coherent sentences that often referenced her private thoughts, fears, and even regrets. Some phrases recounted recent actions, small decisions she thought unnoticed, or fleeting emotions she believed entirely private. The uncanny specificity of these messages suggested an intelligence guiding the writing, an awareness that transcended natural explanation. In those moments, she felt simultaneously watched and understood, as though the diary was both confidant and accuser, comforting yet menacing in equal measure. At night, the diary's influence seemed strongest. Candlelight flickered across the pages, exaggerating the crimson stains, making them appear to writhe or shimmer faintly in the dim glow. The young woman began recording observations in her own hand, comparing entries from day to day, desperate to identify patterns or triggers. Sleep became fitful, interrupted by dreams that mirrored the diary's messages, blurring the boundary between waking reality and the subconscious. Each morning, she awoke with a lingering sense of foreboding, half expecting to find new words awaiting her even before her eyes fully adjusted to the light. The psychological weight of anticipation, of knowing she could not ignore the diary, compounded her anxiety and began to influence her behavior in subtle, pervasive ways. Neighbors and close friends, when informed of her claims, reacted with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Some laughed nervously, attributing her experiences to stress, imagination, or youthful fancy, while others exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that she was encountering something inexplicable. Their responses, however, could not diminish the tangible reality she experienced each morning. The diary was no idle prank, it was a persistent presence, intruding upon her life with a precision that defied coincidence. Even small gestures, like the diary's occasional pages being found open to a blank sheet with an immediate, spontaneous sentence appearing, reinforced the sense that she was interacting with an active, responsive entity. The young woman's obsession with understanding the diary intensified. She began to catalogue each appearance meticulously, noting the exact time, phrasing, and circumstances surrounding every new inscription. Patterns seemed to emerge and then dissolve, creating a cyclical rhythm that both fascinated and tormented her. The diary's messages were not always ominous, but even the seemingly benign sentences carried a weight, a subtle insistence that she acknowledged their significance. By engaging with it, she felt drawn into a labyrinth of mystery, one that challenged her perception of reality, blurred boundaries of personal privacy, and forced her to confront the possibility of forces beyond natural comprehension. By the end of this initial period, the diary had transformed from a mere object into a central, almost living presence in her daily life. The early signs and anomalies, once dismissed as coincidence or imagination, had taken on undeniable clarity. They marked the beginning of a slow, inexorable unraveling, both psychological and social, as the young woman's private reality began to intertwine with the diary's uncanny communications. What had begun as curiosity now held the seeds of fear, obsession, and the recognition that she was entangled with something beyond reason, something that would demand engagement and perhaps, in time, exact its own consequences. As news of the diary's strange behavior began to circulate quietly, neighbors and distant relatives took notice, though no one dared speak too openly. Whispers traveled along the narrow streets of the town, carried in cautious tones from doorstep to doorstep, from marketplace stalls to the pews of the small church. Some spoke with incredulity, dismissing the claims as exaggeration or youthful fantasy, while others leaned in, curiosity mingled with unease. Those who had known the family for years sensed an unusual tension, a subtle shift in demeanor that suggested something extraordinary was occurring behind closed doors. The diary, once confined to the private realm of the young woman's room, now cast its influence outward, touching the broader community through rumor, observation, and conjecture. Witnesses began to recount what they had seen or heard, often reluctantly, as if speaking the truth carried a tangible risk. A neighbor claimed to have glimpsed the young woman's room illuminated late into the night, the candlelight flickering against drawn curtains, shadows moving in ways that defied explanation. Another mentioned hearing soft murmurs, words too quiet to discern, yet accompanied by a sense of distress and urgency that hung in the air like a dense fog. Each testimony, while incomplete or contradictory, contributed to a mosaic of unease, suggesting that the diary's influence extended beyond the personal, reaching into the perceptions and consciousness of those nearby. The tension between disbelief and observation created an atmosphere ripe for speculation, where the extraordinary could take root even in the absence of concrete evidence. The whispers, though tentative, began to affect the town's social dynamics. Families who were once friendly now exchanged cautious glances, and conversations became laden with subtext. Merchants, priests, and local scholars debated the diary's nature in hushed tones, balancing rational skepticism with the acknowledgement of anomalies they could not readily dismiss. The local children, perceptive to undercurrents, spoke of strange lights and voices in the night, their imaginations bridging the gap between reality and legend. The diary, through its owner and the ripple effect of fear, was shaping perceptions, influencing behavior, and subtly altering the social fabric of the town. Even casual encounters carried an unspoken question: what, exactly, was happening within that household? Some witnesses, driven by genuine concern, attempted direct observation, hoping to see the diary for themselves. They described a room that seemed almost alive with energy, shadows that shifted independently of the candle's flicker, and the unmistakable presence of a tension that made ordinary objects appear charged with meaning. Occasionally, they would glimpse the crimson markings on the pages, ephemeral yet vivid, forming words that were incomprehensible or frighteningly familiar. Each observation deepened the sense of mystery and lent credibility to the young woman's accounts, even as it blurred the line between rational explanation and supernatural influence. The act of witnessing became an uneasy participation in a phenomenon that resisted understanding, compelling observers to reconcile their own perceptions with the inexplicable reality before them. Religious leaders in the town became involved as the whispers grew louder. Priests and ministers visited discreetly, offering prayers, blessings, and counsel, hoping to protect the young woman from what they feared might be a malevolent influence. Their presence, however, often had the unintended effect of heightening tension. The diary's messages, already personal and uncanny, seemed to respond to these interventions with even greater specificity, referencing the visits or subtly challenging the efficacy of spiritual remedies. This interplay between observation, intervention, and response intensified the sense that the diary was sentient in some manner, an intelligence capable of perceiving and reacting to human attention. Witnesses left these visits with lingering unease, unsure whether their involvement had alleviated or exacerbated the situation. The psychological effect on the young woman was magnified by the presence of witnesses. She became increasingly aware of the gaze of others, the weight of their scrutiny adding to the diary's already oppressive influence. Even casual comments from neighbors could trigger responses from the book, messages that seemed timed to coincide with conversations or observations. The once private phenomenon was evolving into a communal mystery, a shared tension that amplified fear and speculation. Witness accounts were often filtered through their own biases, creating layers of ambiguity and conflicting narratives, further complicating the town's perception of events. Each whispered story, each tentative observation, served to elevate the diary from a personal anomaly to a communal enigma, a focal point of both fear and fascination. The young woman, aware of the growing attention, oscillated between hope and dread. On one hand, she sought validation, a witness to confirm the reality she experienced each day. On the other, she feared exposure, the possibility that public scrutiny might provoke the diary's messages in unforeseen ways. The diary's presence was no longer contained, it had begun to shape the consciousness of the town, influencing how neighbors thought, spoke, and even moved within their own homes. The boundary between private experience and communal awareness became increasingly porous, as each new witness added their perception, their interpretation, and their own anxieties to the narrative. Rumors began to take on a life of their own. Tales of mysterious lights, whispers of voices in the night, and the notion of a book that knew its owner spread slowly, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes eerily accurate. The tension between skeptics and believers created subtle divisions in the community, even as curiosity drew people closer to the house. Some were motivated by fear, others by fascination, and all were influenced by the knowledge that something unusual was occurring. The diary's growing prominence in local consciousness ensured that it could no longer be treated as a mere curiosity, it had become a catalyst for psychological and social ripples, challenging reason, belief, and the very sense of what was possible. By the end of this period, the diary had transcended its physical presence. Through the accumulation of witness accounts and whispered stories, it had begun to assert an influence that reached beyond the owner's room, shaping perception and behavior across the town. The whispers, the glimpses, the fearful observations, all contributed to a growing tapestry of suspense and unease, as the community slowly became entangled in a phenomenon that defied explanation. The diary's presence, once intimate and private, now loomed as a subtle yet undeniable force, touching lives, bending reality, and leaving the town suspended between rational understanding and the profound, creeping dread of the unknown. Tensions in the town escalated as the strange diary attracted the attention of both spiritual authorities and early practitioners of science. The local ministers and priests, alarmed by the whispered tales and witness accounts, insisted that the diary was a conduit of evil, a manifestation of sin, or perhaps even the work of a malevolent spirit. They cautioned the young woman and her family to cease engaging with it, offering prayers, blessings, and warnings of divine judgment. Each intervention, however, seemed only to provoke subtle responses in the diary itself, with messages appearing that referenced the visits or hinted at the ineffectiveness of these spiritual remedies. The clergy's presence, rather than providing solace, heightened the sense of dread and underscored the tension between faith and fear, as the ordinary rules of religion appeared powerless against the diary's uncanny activity. At the same time, the growing curiosity of the town's more rational minds created a counterpoint to the spiritual perspective. Local physicians, scholars, and those with an interest in natural philosophy attempted to explain the phenomenon through empirical means. They tested the diary's ink, paper, and storage conditions, hypothesizing that condensation, chemical reactions, or environmental factors could account for the sudden appearance of words. Despite repeated experiments, nothing offered a satisfactory explanation. The ink remained vivid, fresh, and seemingly deliberate, forming coherent sentences that were sometimes eerily accurate about recent events in the young woman's life. The conflict between religious interpretation and early scientific inquiry created a charged atmosphere, each side trying to assert authority while failing to account for the mystery fully. The young woman found herself caught between these opposing forces, her isolation deepening as both faith and reason offered incomplete comfort. The clergy urged her to repent and seek spiritual cleansing, while scientists insisted she record observations, monitor environmental variables, and apply logical reasoning to the diary's messages. Each approach revealed its limitations. Spiritual interventions could not prevent the diary from writing, and rational tests could not explain the specificity or timeliness of the messages. The tension of these failures eroded her confidence in both systems of understanding, leaving her increasingly dependent on her own observations and interpretations. This duality of attempted control, faith versus reason, emphasized the diary's defiance of ordinary frameworks of comprehension, creating a psychological strain that intensified with each passing day. In addition to external pressures, the family itself struggled to manage the diary's influence. Siblings and parents attempted to mediate the situation with varying degrees of success, alternating between supportive curiosity and anxious prohibition. The young woman's mother often remained near her daughter, offering comfort, yet even she could not fully grasp the depth of the diary's impact. The father oscillated between skepticism and concern, enforcing strict household rules in an attempt to restore normalcy, yet finding that conventional discipline had little effect on either the diary or his daughter's growing obsession. This interplay of familial dynamics added another layer of tension, highlighting the intersection of domestic life, communal expectation, and the inexplicable presence of the diary. Visits from religious authorities became more formal, often accompanied by the townspeople themselves, adding social pressure to the already fraught situation. Ministers held prayers over the diary, sometimes sprinkling holy water, attempting exorcisms, or reading scripture aloud, all in the hope of suppressing what they perceived as supernatural interference. Each ritual, however, seemed to be anticipated or referenced in the diary's messages, creating a disconcerting sense of responsiveness that defied ordinary causality. The young woman, observing these events, felt a mixture of fear, awe, and helplessness. She recognized that the diary operated on its own terms, not constrained by the moral or spiritual authority that typically governed her world. Simultaneously, the scientific perspective continued to push forward, though with mounting frustration. Local scholars attempted to isolate the diary in controlled conditions, measuring temperature, humidity, and exposure to light, hoping to trigger or suppress the writing. Experiments were recorded meticulously, notes scattered across tables and in separate ledgers, yet the diary persisted, producing messages regardless of containment or observation. Even the application of chemical reagents failed to reveal any plausible mechanism. These repeated failures reinforced a sense of futility among rational observers, suggesting that whatever intelligence or force governed the diary was not subject to natural law or conventional reasoning. The interplay between religious admonitions and scientific inquiry created an atmosphere charged with contradiction. Townspeople witnessed interventions that should have produced results but did not, leaving them unsure whether to believe in divine protection, demonic influence, or unknown natural forces. This ambiguity heightened the diary's aura of mystery, as observers were forced to confront the limitations of both belief and reason. The young woman, as the central figure in this conflict, bore the psychological weight of divided attention, internalizing the conflicting messages and struggling to navigate the expectations of both her community and her own sense of reality. Moreover, the diary itself seemed to escalate its activity in response to these interventions. Messages became more pointed, sometimes addressing the nature of faith, reason, and observation directly. They commented on the prayers offered, the chemicals tested, and even the doubts voiced by observers. The tone was measured yet unmistakably perceptive, as if the diary were aware of the broader context and subtly guiding the psychological experience of both the young woman and those around her. This responsiveness further blurred the line between natural and supernatural, adding an element of cognitive dissonance for all involved. The young woman's interactions with both faith and science also altered her daily life. She began maintaining detailed journals of her own, recording the timing, phrasing, and circumstances of each message, in hopes of identifying patterns or triggers. Sleep became irregular, often interrupted by anticipation or anxiety, and her perception of ordinary sounds and movements was heightened, each creak of the floorboards or rustle of wind amplifying her sense of unease. The diary had become not only a source of mystery but a central organizing force in her consciousness, mediating her understanding of reality and intensifying the psychological strain imposed by both religious admonitions and scientific scrutiny. By the conclusion of this period, the struggle between faith and reason had become a defining feature of the diary's presence. Neither approach could fully account for its behavior, and both seemed to provoke subtle yet deliberate responses. The young woman existed at the intersection of these competing frameworks, isolated and burdened, as the diary continued to operate with precision and intent. The town itself, watching and participating in this dynamic, became a stage for a slow, inexorable escalation of tension, fear, and wonder, as the diary's enigmatic influence defied both belief and empirical scrutiny. The diary's influence on the young woman grew steadily, almost imperceptibly at first, until it became the central axis around which her life revolved. Each day, she awoke with an uneasy anticipation, half expecting to discover a new message written in vivid crimson ink across the familiar pages. These messages had evolved from simple observations into elaborate, sometimes accusatory statements that referenced her most private thoughts, past mistakes, and fleeting emotions. The precision with which the diary mirrored her inner life was unnerving. It was as though the book possessed not only awareness but an intimate understanding of her psyche. The weight of this realization pressed upon her constantly, shaping her perceptions, interactions, and even her ability to rest. Her obsession intensified as she began to recognize subtle patterns in the diary's behavior. Words often appeared at pivotal moments, sometimes in response to fleeting thoughts, other times anticipating events before they occurred. The diary's messages became increasingly psychological in nature, probing her fears, insecurities, and doubts. Each line seemed deliberately crafted to provoke reflection or unease, and she could not ignore them without experiencing a gnawing sense of incompleteness. Nights were the hardest, when candlelight flickered across the pages, casting long shadows on the walls and making the crimson letters seem to pulse with a life of their own. She would spend hours tracing each word with trembling fingers, as if by touching them she could uncover the source or control the unseen force behind them. Family members watched with growing concern as her behavior changed. She withdrew further into her room, spoke less, and became increasingly defensive when questioned about the diary's content. The presence of witnesses no longer alleviated her fear, if anything, it intensified the sense of scrutiny and expectation. Friends and relatives who tried to comfort her were met with nervous glances, evasive answers, or the desperate insistence that she needed to focus on understanding the diary herself. Her isolation became both physical and psychological, as the diary demanded attention at all hours and subtly dictated the terms of engagement. The home, once a place of security, had become a space charged with tension, shadows, and anticipation. The diary's messages often blurred the boundary between observation and accusation. Lines would reference specific behaviors, mistakes, or fears, delivered in a tone that was at once intimate and unsettling. Some phrases appeared supportive or cautionary, yet their underlying implication carried a weight that unsettled her deeply. It was as if the book were holding a mirror to her soul, reflecting thoughts and emotions she had never voiced, and challenging her to confront them directly. Each new entry heightened both fascination and fear, drawing her deeper into a cycle of obsessive engagement that made ordinary life increasingly difficult. Sleep, already fragmented by anxiety, became a battleground for her mind. Dreams often mirrored the diary's messages, intertwining reality and subconscious perception in ways that left her disoriented upon waking. Shadows in her room seemed to lengthen and move independently of the candlelight, and even the quietest sounds, the wind against the window, the creak of floorboards, felt laden with significance. The diary's presence altered her perception of the environment itself, transforming familiar objects and spaces into elements of a heightened, almost gothic reality. Everyday routines became infused with tension. Walking through hallways or sitting near the hearth was now accompanied by an unshakable sense of anticipation, a knowledge that the diary's next message could appear at any moment, in any form. The psychological toll was compounded by the diary's apparent responsiveness. It seemed attuned not only to her actions and thoughts but also to the interventions of others. Clergy, family members, and even visiting scholars attempted various methods to discern or suppress the diary's influence, yet each effort seemed to elicit new, often pointed messages. The young woman began to sense that any engagement with the diary carried consequence, that the act of observation or inquiry itself was acknowledged and reflected in the text. This sense of dialogue, whether literal or imagined, deepened her obsession and made detachment nearly impossible. Over time, she developed routines to manage the diary's influence, cataloging each message, noting the time of appearance, and attempting to interpret patterns or triggers. Yet these rituals provided only partial relief. Each new entry was unpredictable in content and tone, sometimes alarming, sometimes cryptic, and always carrying a psychological weight that made it impossible to ignore. The diary's presence became a lens through which she experienced the world, coloring interactions, shaping emotional responses, and transforming mundane moments into episodes of heightened tension and significance. The intensity of the diary's effect extended beyond her internal life. Her relationships with others became strained, as the obsessive attention demanded by the book left little room for ordinary social engagement. Conversations were brief and cautious, her gaze often lingered on the diary, her mind perpetually anticipating the next message. Friends and family, aware of the changes, oscillated between concern and helplessness, unable to intervene without risking further escalation. The diary had created a private universe in which the young woman existed, one that was increasingly isolated, structured around the mysterious intelligence of the Crimson Script. By this stage, the diary had assumed a central, almost commanding role in her life. Its messages dictated emotional responses, guided attention, and imposed an unrelenting psychological presence. The combination of isolation, obsessive scrutiny, and the uncanny precision of the writings created a slow-burning tension, a sense that her own mind and environment were increasingly governed by the diary's inscrutable intelligence. What began as subtle anomalies had become a pervasive force, shaping thought, perception, and behavior with an inexorable, almost sentient insistence. The diary was no longer merely a book, it had become the axis of her existence, the defining element of daily life, and the source of an unsettling intimacy that she could neither escape nor fully comprehend. Despite repeated attempts to rationalize the diary's behavior, explanations continually failed, deepening both fear and fascination. Local scholars and physicians scrutinized the pages with meticulous attention, testing the paper for chemical anomalies, observing the writing for patterns, and considering natural phenomena that might account for the crimson messages. They hypothesized that condensation, humidity, or perhaps the reaction of iron-laden ink with environmental factors could produce the sudden appearance of words. Despite careful measurements, controlled experiments, and repeated observation, none of these theories could adequately explain the specificity, timing, and intimate knowledge conveyed in the diary's entries. Every failed explanation only heightened the sense that the diary operated beyond the boundaries of natural law, a force that defied both observation and reason. Community tension escalated as the diary's presence continued to produce phenomena that could not be reconciled with ordinary understanding. Minor accidents in the household, spilled liquids, objects falling inexplicably, and sudden temperature fluctuations, were attributed, rightly or wrongly, to the diary's influence. Unexplained illnesses and bouts of malaise among family members and occasional visitors further complicated interpretations. Some townspeople began to speak of curses, invisible presences, or divine punishment, while others clung to rational explanations, insisting that the occurrences were coincidental or psychosomatic. The interplay of these conflicting perspectives added layers of complexity, as the town struggled to integrate the inexplicable events into their understanding of reality. Attempts to remove or destroy the diary met with unexpected resistance. The young woman and her family tried locking it away, burying it, and even attempting to burn pages, yet new messages would appear, sometimes on previously untouched sheets, sometimes in new locations entirely. The persistence of the diary suggested an intelligence guiding the process, an awareness of attempts to control or suppress it. Each failed effort reinforced the impression that the diary was not merely a passive object but an active presence, capable of responding to human intervention with uncanny precision. This sense of autonomy imbued the book with a subtle yet pervasive menace, a force that could not be reasoned with, prayed over, or contained. The social impact of the diary's inexplicable behavior extended beyond the household. Neighbors reported observing unusual occurrences, flickering lights, strange sounds, and glimpses of shadows that seemed to move independently of natural causes. Rumors spread, often exaggerated, contributing to a collective tension that intensified the young woman's sense of isolation. Even those who initially doubted the diary's significance could not ignore the repeated reports of its strange influence. The community became divided between skeptics, believers, and those too fearful to engage with the situation at all. The diary had, in effect, transformed from a private phenomenon into a shared enigma, influencing perception, behavior, and social dynamics in profound ways. Within the household, the psychological strain intensified. The young woman's obsession with cataloging the diary's entries became a compulsive routine, as she attempted to anticipate new messages, identify patterns, and interpret meanings. Sleep became increasingly fragmented, nights were filled with dreams that mirrored the diary's content, amplifying anxiety and blurring the line between waking reality and the subconscious. The candlelight that once offered comfort now cast flickering shadows that seemed alive, echoing the movements and intentions of the crimson script. Ordinary objects, tables, chairs, curtains, appeared imbued with significance, each glance or movement potentially interacting with the diary's mysterious influence. The sense of futility created a feedback loop of fear and obsession. The more attempts were made to rationalize or control the diary, the more compelling and unexplainable its behavior seemed. Scientific investigation, spiritual intervention, and domestic management all failed to suppress or clarify the phenomenon. This cycle reinforced the young woman's isolation and heightened the emotional intensity surrounding the diary. Each new entry, each unexplained occurrence, was amplified by prior experiences of failure, creating a slow but inexorable spiral of psychological pressure. Messages from the diary itself grew more complex, incorporating subtle references to earlier observations, failed interventions, and communal scrutiny. It was as if the diary were tracking both the household's internal responses and the broader social context, integrating this awareness into each new line of text. The writing was deliberate, precise, and sometimes accusatory, forcing reflection, fear, and anticipation in equal measure. This responsiveness blurred the boundary between inanimate object and sentient presence, creating a psychological tension that was both captivating and oppressive. Observers outside the immediate household began to recognize the futility of explanation. Ministers, physicians, and scholars each attempted to assert authority over the diary, yet none succeeded. Some concluded that the phenomenon was beyond comprehension, an anomaly that defied categorization, while others suggested more sinister interpretations, including supernatural intervention or moral reckoning. The diary's behavior had, by this stage, become a central force in shaping perception, dictating attention, and influencing the emotional climate of both the household and the wider community. In response to these failures, the young woman's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Her focus was consumed by the diary, her mental and emotional energy devoted entirely to interpreting its messages, anticipating its next communication, and navigating the consequences of its presence. Ordinary activities became secondary, and the sense of omnipresence surrounding the diary intensified. The cumulative effect of repeated failures, social pressure, and the diary's persistent activity produced a slow-burning panic, a sense of helplessness tempered by a compulsive need for engagement, as if understanding the book were both necessary and impossible. By the conclusion of this period, the diary had asserted itself as a force beyond reason, faith, or ordinary intervention. Failed explanations and repeated frustrations reinforced its unassailable authority, establishing it as a central presence in both the young woman's life and the consciousness of the town. The escalation of events, minor accidents, and the inability to contain or suppress the diary created a pervasive atmosphere of unease, anticipation, and dread. The household and community were drawn into a cycle of observation, interpretation, and psychological pressure, as the diary's enigmatic intelligence continued to challenge understanding, blur boundaries, and command attention with an inexorable persistence. The household's atmosphere had grown taut with anxiety, each member acutely aware of the diary's relentless presence. What had begun as subtle disturbances had escalated into full psychological domination, shaping daily routines and interactions with a quiet but undeniable authority. The young woman, at the center of this storm, moved through the rooms with a heightened awareness of every shadow, every sound, every flicker of light. The diary's messages had evolved into complex communications, layering observations of her private thoughts with subtle insinuations, moral judgments, and occasionally cryptic warnings. Each line seemed to anticipate her reactions, to predict her fears, and to reinforce the omnipresence of its influence. Isolation deepened as the young woman became increasingly consumed by the diary. She spent hours poring over each page, cataloging entries, analyzing word choice, and attempting to decipher underlying patterns. Sleep became fragmented, punctuated by dreams that mirrored the diary's messages and distorted reality with an eerie fidelity. Shadows in her room elongated unnaturally in candlelight, and ordinary objects assumed a charged presence, as though the house itself were an extension of the diary's influence. Even the movement of air, the faint creak of floorboards, or the rustle of curtains seemed to echo the book's communication, reinforcing a sense that she was perpetually observed and subtly guided by an unseen intelligence. Family members struggled to manage the escalating psychological strain. Conversations became increasingly cautious, measured, and deliberate, as though any casual remark might provoke a reaction from the diary. Siblings and parents oscillated between protective concern and helpless frustration, unsure how to intervene without exacerbating the young woman's obsession. Attempts to remove the diary from her possession were met with resistance, not only from her but from the inexplicable persistence of the messages themselves. Words appeared on previously blank pages, new sentences materialized in the margins, and in some instances, fresh lines formed on previously stored sheets, suggesting that containment was impossible and that the diary's influence transcended physical boundaries. The diary's writings grew more psychologically incisive, probing vulnerabilities, past regrets, and fleeting insecurities with a precision that unsettled her deeply. Sentences referenced private thoughts and events unknown to anyone else, demonstrating a knowledge that could not be attributed to coincidence. The language oscillated between gentle counsel and subtle reprimand, creating a complex emotional landscape that drew her deeper into obsessive engagement. She became both fascinated and terrified by the diary's capacity to reflect her inner life, its crimson script functioning as a mirror that revealed hidden fears and unarticulated desires. Community awareness of the diary's behavior also intensified during this period. Rumors circulated more widely, and local witnesses claimed to see faint lights flickering in the windows at odd hours or to hear whispers and movements when no one was present. The tension between skepticism and belief created subtle social divisions. Some dismissed the events as fabrication or exaggeration, while others regarded the diary as a supernatural manifestation of moral reckoning or a test of faith. The social pressure, combined with the young woman's increasingly visible distress, amplified the psychological impact of the diary, reinforcing the sense that it operated not only within her personal sphere but also across the consciousness of the town. Attempts at intervention, whether through religious ritual or scientific observation, proved ineffective and sometimes counterproductive. Clergy visits prompted messages that referenced the prayers or warnings offered, often in ways that questioned their efficacy. Scientific tests, which measured environmental conditions, lighting, and chemical properties of ink and paper, yielded no explanations. The diary appeared responsive, acknowledging and adapting to each attempt at control, further solidifying its enigmatic authority. This duality, simultaneous resistance to both faith and reason, reinforced a sense of helplessness and heightened obsession, as the young woman realized that conventional frameworks could not contain or explain the phenomenon. Her mental and emotional energy became increasingly monopolized by the diary, shaping perception, behavior, and daily decision-making. Even mundane tasks were filtered through the lens of anticipation. Each action, conversation, or observation carried the potential to interact with the diary's next message. The young woman's growing reliance on the book for understanding, reassurance, or forewarning created a cycle in which attention and obsession fed each other, deepening the psychological imprint of the diary's presence. Ordinary experiences became layered with tension and meaning, as the boundaries between the diary's influence and external reality blurred. By now, the diary's presence had transformed the household into a chamber of subtle terror and relentless engagement. Its messages demanded attention, provoked introspection, and elicited emotional responses that could not be ignored. The young woman's life became increasingly regimented around the diary's activity, with each day punctuated by the expectation of new writings and the mental exertion of interpreting their significance. Shadows, sounds, and the very layout of the home were infused with heightened perception, creating an environment where the ordinary and the uncanny were indistinguishably intertwined. The slow psychological decay and increasing isolation were compounded by the diary's persistent responsiveness. Messages referenced prior interventions, noted the presence of observers, and occasionally questioned the young woman's interpretations of its intent. The diary's intelligence, if it could be so called, created a feedback loop in which fear, anticipation, and obsessive analysis reinforced one another. The home, the family, and the town all became participants in an intricate dance with the diary, each element influencing and being influenced in turn, producing a narrative of suspense, tension, and unrelenting psychological engagement. By the conclusion of this period, the diary had solidified its role as the dominant force in the young woman's life and the household at large. Its influence extended beyond mere communication, shaping thought, emotion, and perception with inexorable precision. The escalating tension, persistent psychological presence, and inability of external interventions to alter its behavior established the diary as an entity of profound and unsettling authority, a catalyst for both internal and communal unease. The household existed now in a delicate balance, suspended between the familiar and the uncanny, as the diary continued to dictate the rhythm of life with relentless, almost sentient insistence. The diary's presence had now become an inescapable force, its influence weaving itself into every facet of the young woman's existence. Daily routines were dictated by the anticipation of new messages, and even the simplest activities, preparing meals, walking through hallways, or tending to chores, were overshadowed by the constant awareness that the diary might reveal a new entry at any moment. Each day brought the creeping dread of expectation, the psychological tension of waiting for words that were simultaneously intimate and accusatory. The young woman found herself walking a narrow line between fascination and fear, compelled to engage with the book while increasingly aware of the toll it was exacting on her mind and spirit. The content of the diary continued to evolve, shifting from simple observations to more direct commentary on her behavior, thoughts, and emotions. It seemed capable of anticipating her reactions, offering warnings or guidance that aligned uncannily with recent events, and referencing moments she had assumed were private and unobserved. This precision was both unnerving and magnetic, creating an obsessive compulsion to read, record, and reflect upon every line. Shadows cast by candlelight on the pages gave the words a shifting, almost living quality, making the reading experience an emotionally immersive encounter. Each sentence carried psychological weight, drawing the young woman further into a cycle of intense engagement that was impossible to ignore or fully rationalize. The psychological strain began to manifest in increasingly noticeable ways. Her posture grew tense, her gaze frequently distant, and conversations were often interrupted by sudden shifts in attention toward the diary. She spent long hours documenting entries, analyzing phrasing, and cross-referencing messages with her own thoughts and actions, attempting to decode a pattern that might provide clarity or control. Sleep became erratic and filled with vivid dreams that mirrored the diary's content, blending reality and imagination in ways that left her disoriented upon waking. Even brief moments of distraction were suffused with anxiety, the expectation of new writing always lurking at the periphery of consciousness. Family members, though increasingly aware of the diary's overwhelming effect, found themselves powerless to intervene effectively. Attempts to enforce separation, regulate reading times, or introduce distractions often failed, as the diary's influence extended beyond its physical presence. Words would appear on previously blank pages, in hidden corners, or even on sheets thought to have been removed from circulation, suggesting that containment was futile. The young woman's responses oscillated between dread, fascination, and occasional defiance, revealing the complex interplay between her agency and the seemingly sentient force that dictated the diary's activity. The community remained a subtle, ever-present observer of the unfolding psychological drama. Neighbors and distant relatives reported seeing lights flicker in the young woman's room at late hours, hearing whispers that seemed to emanate without source, or sensing a charged atmosphere when passing the house. Rumors grew, circulating in hushed tones about the diary's uncanny knowledge, its persistence, and the extraordinary behavior of its owner. The combination of fear, curiosity, and social scrutiny amplified the tension within the household, creating a feedback loop in which public perception and private experience reinforced each other. The diary's influence had transcended the private sphere, subtly reshaping the consciousness and social dynamics of the town itself. Religious and rational authorities continued to engage with the phenomenon, though their interventions met with mixed or paradoxical results. Clergy offered prayers, blessings, and spiritual guidance, yet the diary often seemed to reference these visits in subsequent entries, sometimes in ways that questioned the efficacy of their efforts. Local scholars and physicians conducted detailed examinations, environmental measurements, and chemical analyses, all of which failed to yield an explanation. The diary responded, directly or indirectly, to these attempts, creating a sense of dialogue and heightening the perception of intelligence behind the writing. This dual defiance of both faith and reason deepened the young woman's isolation and reinforced the notion that the diary operated on terms entirely its own. The content of the messages grew increasingly psychologically invasive. Phrases probed insecurities, past mistakes, and unvoiced fears with precision that was both comforting and terrifying. The diary seemed to understand her emotional state intimately, offering admonishment, reflection, or subtle guidance depending on its perceived assessment of her behavior. These interactions intensified her emotional dependency, creating a relationship with the book that was simultaneously relational and oppressive. She could not ignore it without a sense of anxiety, nor could she fully surrender without fear of consequence. This intricate interplay of control, fascination, and dread became the central axis of her daily life. As the days stretched into weeks, the diary's effect extended beyond cognitive and emotional realms into physical and environmental perception. Candlelight exaggerated the vividness of crimson letters, shadows danced across walls with eerie independence, and ordinary household objects seemed imbued with heightened significance. Even minor sounds, a floorboard creak, a rustling curtain, the whisper of wind, were interpreted as meaningful either in dialogue with the diary or as omens foretelling its next message. The environment itself became a stage upon which the diary's influence was enacted, reinforcing the slow psychological escalation and embedding a pervasive sense of suspense and unease. By this stage, the diary had fully dominated the young woman's consciousness. Her existence, once guided by routine and social interaction, was now entirely organized around anticipating, reading, and interpreting its messages. The interweaving of personal fear, obsessive attention, and communal observation created a dense psychological web, leaving her in a liminal space between fascination and terror. The diary was no longer a mere object, it had become a living axis around which perception, emotion, and social reality revolved. Its persistent, precise influence ensured that every thought, movement, and action was filtered through its uncanny presence, shaping both the private and collective experience of the unfolding mystery. The relentless nature of the diary's communication, coupled with the inability of any intervention, religious, rational, or familial, to alter its behavior, cemented a sense of inescapability. The young woman was caught in a slow, unyielding psychological spiral, her life increasingly dictated by a force that was simultaneously intimate, inscrutable, and omnipresent. Shadows, words, and whispers became extensions of its influence, creating an environment where ordinary reality was inextricably entwined with the diary's enigmatic presence. By the end of this period, suspense, fear, and obsessive engagement had reached a peak, establishing a stage upon which the diary's ultimate psychological and social impact would continue to unfold. The young woman's life had by now become entirely structured around the diary, each day governed by anticipation, interpretation, and a subtle compulsion to engage with its messages. Sleep offered little respite, as dreams often mirrored or expanded upon the content of the crimson writing, blending reality and subconscious thought into a single, disorienting experience. Even brief moments outside her room were overshadowed by the expectation that the diary might produce a new line, a cryptic warning, or an uncanny observation about her inner life. Every action, whether mundane or significant, seemed to ripple through the prism of the diary's influence, amplifying both anxiety and obsession in equal measure. The psychological intensity of the diary's presence was compounded by its apparent responsiveness. Messages often referenced prior events, observations, or failed interventions, suggesting a level of awareness that was deeply unsettling. At times, the writing offered guidance, gently urging reflection or caution, while at others it seemed accusatory, highlighting mistakes or unspoken fears with a precision that left her unable to dismiss them. This duality, comfort and admonishment intertwined, created a complex emotional relationship, one in which she was simultaneously drawn to and repelled by the book. The interplay of fascination, dread, and obligation became the defining framework of her existence, shaping thought, behavior, and perception with relentless intensity. Interactions with family and visitors were increasingly strained. Attempts to discuss the diary were fraught with tension, as she oscillated between secrecy, defensive deflection, and a desperate need for validation. Family members, though concerned, were often helpless in the face of her growing obsession. Conversations were measured, guarded, and sometimes avoided entirely, as the presence of others could provoke responses from the diary or intensify her emotional state. The household itself became a space charged with anticipation, where every movement, glance, or sound could signal the emergence of new messages. The diary's influence extended beyond words on a page; it had reshaped the very atmosphere, infusing the home with a subtle yet persistent tension. Community observation continued to play a role in the evolving psychological drama. Neighbors reported seeing late-night candlelight flicker behind drawn curtains, hearing hushed whispers or unidentifiable sounds, and sensing an unusual stillness around the house. Rumors, half-formed and often contradictory, spread quietly, generating both fear and curiosity. Some townspeople speculated on supernatural forces, moral retribution, or divine intervention, while others clung to rational explanations, attributing the events to coincidence, imagination, or psychological strain. This mix of skepticism and belief created a charged social environment, reinforcing the sense that the diary's influence extended beyond the immediate household and into the collective consciousness of the town. Religious and rational authorities continued their interventions, though neither approach yielded lasting results. Clergy offered prayers, blessings, and spiritual counsel, which the diary sometimes referenced in subsequent messages, often with subtle commentary or challenge. Local scholars and physicians applied systematic observation, chemical analysis, and environmental measurements, yet the phenomenon persisted, defying conventional logic and scientific explanation. The diary's responsiveness to both spiritual and empirical methods contributed to a sense of sentience, reinforcing the perception that it operated according to its own rules, unbound by human expectations or conventional frameworks. As the diary's presence intensified, the young woman developed elaborate routines to track and interpret its messages. She recorded each line meticulously, noted the timing, phrasing, and context, and attempted to identify patterns or triggers that might offer insight. This ritualized engagement, while providing a semblance of control, also deepened her entanglement. The diary's responses were unpredictable; at times messages appeared immediately, at other times they emerged after hours or days, often reflecting circumstances she had thought private or unobserved. The unpredictability heightened suspense and anxiety, ensuring that her attention remained focused almost exclusively on the book. The psychological impact extended to her perception of the physical environment. Shadows seemed to shift independently of candlelight, ordinary objects appeared imbued with meaning, and minor noises were interpreted as potential signals from the diary. The boundary between reality and perception blurred, creating a heightened, almost gothic atmosphere in the home. Every glance at a page, every rustle of paper, every flicker of light was charged with potential significance, reinforcing a pervasive sense of anticipation and unease. Her surroundings had become extensions of the diary's presence, a subtle yet constant reinforcement of its psychological dominance. The diary's writing itself had evolved to probe deeper into her inner life. Sentences addressed long-buried insecurities, unspoken fears, and private regrets, often with a precision that was both comforting and disturbing. The messages could soothe, admonish, or provoke reflection, creating a multifaceted relationship that demanded constant attention. She became unable to ignore the diary without experiencing anxiety or dread, yet full surrender brought a different kind of psychological tension, as if the book were testing the limits of her engagement. This complex interplay of control and dependency shaped the contours of her daily existence, leaving little room for ordinary thought or distraction. By this stage, the diary had become more than an object, it was a force structuring both her internal and external worlds. Daily life was punctuated by anticipation, analysis, and emotional responses dictated by the message's content. Family dynamics, social interactions, and even simple tasks were filtered through the diary's influence, creating a feedback loop in which fear, fascination, and obsessive engagement reinforced one another. Shadows, sounds, and even the passage of time were imbued with meaning, all interpreted through the lens of the diary's enigmatic presence. The cumulative effect of these dynamics was a slow, inexorable psychological escalation. The young woman's thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions were increasingly dictated by the diary, while external observers, family, neighbors, and visiting authorities, witnessed a phenomenon that defied rational, spiritual, or empirical explanation. The tension between control and helplessness, anticipation and dread, obsession and fear, created a dense psychological landscape in which every moment was charged with suspense. By the conclusion of this period, the diary's dominance was complete, shaping both the internal world of its owner and the perceptions of those around her, establishing an environment in which ordinary reality and uncanny influence were inextricably intertwined. The young woman's life had become entirely enmeshed with the diary, its presence dominating every aspect of her daily existence. Each morning began with a cautious approach to the pages, a delicate ritual of anticipation as she opened the book to discover new messages. The writing had grown more intricate, layered with subtle references to her past thoughts, fears, and experiences, as if the diary had absorbed not just her actions but her very consciousness. Each sentence carried a weight that could not be dismissed, provoking reflection, dread, or sometimes even brief moments of eerie comfort. She found herself compelled to engage continuously, unable to resist reading, recording, and interpreting the crimson words that seemed to breathe life into her days. Her isolation deepened as the diary's influence intensified. Sleep became irregular and filled with vivid dreams that mirrored its messages, blurring the line between night and day. Shadows cast by candlelight stretched and shifted across the room, transforming familiar surroundings into a landscape charged with significance. Ordinary objects, the chair in the corner, the worn rug, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze, were imbued with subtle meaning, each movement or sound interpreted as part of the diary's dialogue with her. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a stage for an ongoing psychological engagement, a space in which anticipation, fear, and obsession intertwined seamlessly with the rhythm of daily life. Family members observed these changes with increasing concern and helplessness. Attempts to intervene, whether by limiting her time with the diary, offering comfort, or engaging in conversation, met with mixed results. She responded with a combination of defensiveness, evasive explanations, and intense focus on her observations of the book. The diary's influence had extended beyond the personal, shaping the dynamics of the household itself. Conversations were punctuated by nervous glances at the pages, moments of silence laden with expectation, and an undercurrent of anxiety that made ordinary interaction fraught with tension. The young woman's engagement with the diary had created a ripple effect, altering the emotional landscape of everyone around her. The broader community remained quietly observant, aware of subtle disturbances and drawn by rumor and speculation. Neighbors reported flickering candlelight behind drawn curtains, faint whispers that seemed to have no source, and moments of uncanny stillness surrounding the home. Some interpreted these phenomena as signs of a supernatural presence, while others sought rational explanations, attributing unusual occurrences to coincidence or heightened anxiety. The mix of fear, curiosity, and skepticism created an atmosphere in which the diary's influence extended far beyond its physical location, touching perceptions, behaviors, and conversations across the town. Religious authorities continued their attempts at intervention, offering prayers, blessings, and spiritual counsel. The diary, however, seemed to respond to these efforts in subtle but unmistakable ways, referencing visits, questioning efficacy, or integrating the interventions into its ongoing messages. Scientific observers, meanwhile, applied careful scrutiny, recording environmental conditions, testing ink and paper, and attempting to rationalize the phenomena. Yet their efforts yielded no definitive explanations, reinforcing the impression that the diary operated according to a set of principles entirely independent of human understanding. The interplay between failed spiritual remedies and unsuccessful rational investigation intensified both the mystery and the psychological pressure on the young woman. The diary's content had grown increasingly precise, almost uncanny in its insight. Lines addressed private fears, past mistakes, and unspoken thoughts, sometimes offering guidance or subtle admonishment. The writing demanded attention, creating an inescapable cycle of observation and interpretation. The young woman's mental energy was consumed by the act of decoding and reflecting upon each message, with every entry reinforcing the diary's dominance over her cognition and emotions. Ordinary life was overshadowed by the anticipation of new words, the weight of their meaning, and the compulsion to remain continually attentive to their presence. This psychological entanglement extended to her perception of the environment. Flickering candlelight, shifting shadows, and the faintest sounds were interpreted as extensions of the diary's influence. Each sensory detail, the creak of a floorboard, the sway of a curtain, the rustle of leaves outside, was imbued with significance, reinforcing the pervasive sense that the book's intelligence extended beyond its pages into the very fabric of her surroundings. Daily life became a delicate negotiation between ordinary action and heightened, almost obsessive awareness, leaving her in a constant state of psychological tension. By this stage, the diary had become the axis of her existence, structuring time, attention, and emotional response. Its influence was unyielding, persistent, and unaccountable by conventional frameworks of faith, reason, or familial intervention. Shadows, words, and whispered impressions merged to form a reality in which ordinary experience and uncanny presence were inseparably entwined. The young woman's engagement with the diary had created a psychological ecosystem in which fear, fascination, and obsessive attention reinforced one another, producing an intricate and relentless cycle of suspense and unease.